and on behalf of Ulster County Executive Jen Metzger, Kingston's Mayor Steve Noble, and I didn't know that he was coming, but he is here, our acting county clerk, Taylor Bruck, our partner. I welcome you all to the first installment of our historic first four-day Burning of Kingston, Voices Lost in the Fire event. And before we commence, let's please have a moment of silence in memory of our dearly departed Ulster County Clerk, the beloved Nina Postupak, who blazed many historic trails during her 40-plus years of dedicated service. Thank you. The theme of this year's event, Voices Lost in the Fire, is indeed a departure from, while at the same time maintains their traditional. The weekend is a sharing of stories well known and an opening to the stories of voices that have been shuttered for far too long. First Nation, women, Black patriots, enslaved, and finally, LGBTQ+. You can clap for that. Yes, indeed, in our small town, we wish to ensure that all voices are heard whenever we bring the truth of Kingston's history to light. And that is why New York State celebrates Kingston as the most progressive historic city in the state. Burning of Kingston, Voices Lost in the Fire is a commemoration, a remembrance of significant events and people in our city's history. We are not at all romanticizing war, as some have written to me or interpret. From tonight's lesser known to never known LGBTQ+ stories to tomorrow's First Nation truths, from Saturday's reenactments and battle scene to the plight, service, and achievements of Africans and African Americans, from Sunday's 5K run to let's have church, as Pastor Rob says, to our finale, chamber music of the Revolutionary War period. There will be times you may feel proud and fascinated. Some stories may shock and awe you, or maybe some may even make you feel ashamed. The bearing of truth isn't always easy. But as I always say, easy is boring. Kingston has been, is, and always will be fire. So I hope that you will join us through our four-day journey, and we want to thank Old Dutch Church for always being the people's cathedral and opening its doors to us, Pastor Liz, Pastor Rob. And this journey will make you feel as if you've literally taken a giant step back in time to the 1700s. And while experience our many intriguing offerings throughout the weekend, we also hope that young composer Samuel Mutter's words during Sunday's world premiere of his composition written specially for the Burning of Kingston will resonate. While acknowledging the tragedy of the Burning of Kingston, let us not label either side with such distinctions as good or evil, heroes or villains. Instead, let us remember the people on both sides of the conflict and their similarities as human beings who experience love and joy, as well as fear and despair. War is a product of greed and hate. These potent ingredients encourage and in some cases force otherwise ordinary people to do extraordinary and evil things. War has always been and will always be terrible. I now present to you tonight's host and ardent supporter of the Burning of Kingston 2024, Raleigh Green.
Good evening. Welcome to the first event of what I am sure is going to be a fun and exciting weekend of Burning of Kingston events. Just a housekeeping thing, if your phone is not on mute, please do so now. My name is Raleigh Green. I'm one of the organizers of the Burning of Kingston, have been for 10 years now. I'm a board member of the Hurley Heritage Society and Museum, and I'm also the coordinator of its lecture series. Tonight is one of those lectures, and I'm proud to be a presenter to this fascinating topic on what life was like for those who were LGBTQ plus in 1777 and during English colonial period. The Early Heritage Society's approach towards our lecture series has been, for the last few years, a desire to bring greater awareness to lesser heard history in Hurley, Ulster, and the Hudson Valley. So, as a history enthusiast, and with a family heritage that traces back to Quakers who came to Kerhonkson in the 17th century, to my studies in anthropology in graduate school, where I studied gender and sexual identities. And I found that the subject of what life must have been like for people of gay, lesbian, bisexual, different people who at that time, if they were discovered, would have been executed. That was profound thinking on my part. And yet, as a graduate student studying anthropology and looking at cross-cultural and cross-time periods of what that was like or how it was expressed, there's not a lot of history about what it was like to be gay in America before World War II. A lot was written afterwards. There's not a great deal before that. So this is fascinating, and I dare say cutting edge kind of research that's being done. So during COVID, or later part of COVID, I ran across this wonderful video on YouTube, and it was Dr. Megan Victor, who was in a discussion presentation on what life was like for LGBTQ people during colonial times. And I thought right then and there, I have to get you here to Kingston. It wasn't a question. And thankfully, you said yes. Thank you. I want to say a huge thank you to the City of Kingston, to Ulster County government, to the Old Dutch Church, and the many local organizations, businesses, and people who have supported and helped to bring history alive right here in Kingston. Thank you. Following tonight's presentation, there'll be an open reception at the Hudson Valley LGBTQ Plus Center. To those who may not be familiar, it's a half a block right down Wall Street at 300 Wall Street, where you can meet Professor Victor then, ask her further questions, talk amongst yourselves, and have a little wine and maybe a brownie. All right? So before I turn it over to Dr. Victor, let me share with you some of her bio. Professor Victor is an anthropological archaeologist with a specialization in historical archaeology. Their research focuses on commensal politics, drinking spaces, trade and exchange, informal economy, the 18th century queer community in the English colonial world, gendered spaces, digital archaeology, and community-driven projects. They received their BA from the University of Michigan, and they received their PhD from and their master's and PhD from the College of William and Mary, and then went on for postdoctoral work at Stanford Archaeology Center. They are now an assistant professor at Queens College in anthropology, where they teach courses on archaeology, including intro, archaeology of North America, digital archaeology, and run numerous internships out of their digital archaeology lab, of which they are a director. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Victor.
Well, thank you so much. That was an incredible introduction. I'm incredibly humbled to be here. Do let me know if the mic ends up working. I'm loud. I'm used to bellowing to the back of a classroom, so don't let me blow this out. Just let me know if I need to tone it down. We're good? All right. The other thing is that this is going to be mildly participatory, in that if you need me to slow down, do that. If you need me to speak up, tell me to do that. And if you have a burning question that cannot wait till the end, I don't know, get up, flail, wave your hands, and I will notice you. Sound good? All right, brilliant. There, see, you're already getting the participation part down. This is perfect. All right, we're good. So as you've been staring at for quite a while, the title of the presentation is, "But Among Our Own Selves We'll Be Free." And as you'll see, this comes from a song that was sung in Molly houses, and we'll get to it. And it speaks to a slightly brighter part of what is a rather dark tale, but one that we ourselves can lighten by telling their stories and by giving a voice to these people who were forgotten for far too long. So because I'm aggressively academic, you get a structure of the presentation to come. You're welcome. There will be no quiz, you're safe. But first, what we're going to do is you'll get just a little bit of theory. It won't be scary. We're going to talk about commensality and sort of what informs drinking spaces and the study thereof, as in, why pick a tavern to meet? Why not any other building in the 18th century? We'll then discuss the 18th century LGBTQ plus community. And then finally, a little taste of what I do, the archaeology itself. But we're keeping it broad, and we're talking about the community itself. And if you're really interested in the archaeology beyond what is in the presentation, we can chat about it after the talk. So commensal politics, this is at the heart of what I study, and it's literally what's going to happen afterwards. Part of the incentive to come chat with me afterwards, as you heard, was that there would be wine. You laugh, but it's true, right? And so this is the sharing of food and drink with some other goal in mind, right? Come talk to Victor, I promise we'll feed you. And so if you have social negotiation, people will come, provided you sweeten the deal with a snack. This is commensal politics. It just sounds better to say it that way in an academic paper. We exchange both emotional and symbolic acts when we do this. We reinforce expertise. We reinforce power relations. And there's often some sort of etiquette to it. There's often a specialized location. Certain things happen in certain places, and this doesn't necessarily surprise us. If you want to go and grab a coffee, it makes much more sense to go to a coffee shop than to try and grab a coffee from the strange coffee maker at the mechanic. You can do it, but it's not the ideal date location. So we have locations crafted for this sharing of food and drink. Throughout time, we have seen this happening as long as humans have been lured into places by snacks. One is community-based. You're welcome to laugh, it's all good. One is a community-based type of feast. And we see this in the form of the potluck or potlatch, where the whole community comes together and the person in charge gives themselves into penury to show that they are so good at distribution, that they are able to support their community. Another is the empowering or patron role feast, that someone says, look, come fight for me. I'll feed you. You'll go to war. And they said, yeah, actually, they provide really good food. That's totally worth going to war for. I'd do that again. And then there's diacritical. This involves special knowledge. It shows that you're part of the in crowd. You go to feel like you belong. You know exactly what fork to pick up when, and you can laugh at the person that doesn't. All of these are ways of reinforcing belonging. Often, the example I use when talking to students and trying to explain this, and perhaps some of you may remember this from any of your school days is that if someone wants you to come stay late and do something, what do they offer? We promise we will bring pizza. You got it. We'll have pizza. Please come, listen to the informational meeting, sign up, do extra work, do unpaid labor. Right? We'll do it for pizza. So we still do it today. Taverns are a place where feasts take place. But so often in archaeology and anthropology and history, we seem to forget this, and yet it meets all the qualifications. It has food, usually. It definitely has alcohol. It is a specialized location, so much so that we've given it a name, the tavern. And there are generally at least 2 people there, if it's going to survive, and often groups. Now, because of the presence of alcohol, we have far more going on at a tavern than we would at your local pizza parlor. We have what I posit is known as the alka-social space. Yeah, you're with it, right? So this is a place specifically for both consuming alcohol and getting absolutely schnockered with friends. Because if you wanted to just drink, you'd do it at home. Maybe. And if you wanted to just be with people, you don't need alcohol. But there's this unique blending that happens in drinking spaces. And so we have alcohol and patrons. We have a social environment that allows you to get away with things. And suddenly, now it starts to make sense why things could happen in a tavern. Taverns are inherently transgressive and liminal. The presence of alcohol allows for actual behavior because you're schnockered, or behavior that other people are bad witnesses to because maybe they were schnockered. Or, are you sure you saw that? How much did you have? And because of the loosening of inhibitions, the lack of accountability, or the perception thereof, everything's a little fuzzy. And so the tavern saw all kinds of things in the 18th century that no other building saw. It saw deals made on the table and things slipped underneath. It saw all kinds of plans that were made, and it saw trysts that slipped into rooms. And against this background was a safe space for those who, if they got to be who they were in public, they would be just as publicly executed. I want to show you what an average tavern looks like. These are the public, non-hidden rooms. Can you tell what's going on? Because the average individual in the 18th century really couldn't. And this was very much to everyone's advantage. This is a coffee shop in the 18th century. It kind of looks a lot like a bar. It was. So another important thing to know is that documentary records often tell us that things are happening in coffee shops, and for a long time scholars ruled out the activities because they said, well, we know that if these gentlemen were going to meet, they were going to meet in taverns. This says coffee shop. This must be above board. This is fine. There was more alcohol on offer than anything else at a coffee shop. So, what was the role of the tavern other than for drinking? Because if that's the case, you would think that a lot of colonies that were really focused on order, whether they were Dutch or English, and we're focusing heavily on the English here, but I have to mention the Dutch, given the location, they wouldn't want a tavern. Well, these were viewed as key places of meeting for anything secular, anything you wouldn't want to say in the church. you would say in the tavern. They were great for individual or group meetings, and the best part, you didn't have to pay the bill to keep them warm or lit. So if you had a meeting that was going to go long into the night, why use your own candles? This was a big deal, especially on a night like tonight. Taverns were so crucial that most documents establishing settlements, whether they were Dutch or English, mandated that there had to be at least one tavern to ensure that people did not go crazy. They were seen as preventing anarchy. These places filled with alcohol. You see, because they were filled with alcohol, even though they were mandated to be there for all of your non-religious discussions, they were fantastic places to have all the discussions you'd never say in church. So they were excellent for addressing anything you had a problem with and for resisting any rules that you had a problem with. And so it should come as no surprise that the revolution was planned in a series of taverns. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 was planned at the Raleigh Tavern, a tavern that I helped excavate when I worked in Virginia. The Sons of Liberty hovered around the Green Dragon, and Thomas Jefferson penned the first draft of the Declaration of Independence in the Indian Queen Tavern. If anyone peeked over his shoulders and thought they saw something, they could be accused of maybe not being so sober. But taverns were places of belonging. This group belonging of the feast existed in taverns, as was pointed out. There are group spaces, there's food, there's special buildings. That's inescapable. There's centers for community sociability. And you can go into a bar today and kind of tell what profession frequents it, what nationality, what ethnic group, what economic class. And those private spaces carried that community feel in with them. So it's no surprise that the Molly House is seen within a tavern. So what's a Molly House? The subject of our talk today. These were clandestine, hidden locations where a subset, a subculture of 18th century gay men and cross-dressing individuals would socialize in perceived safety. And they would meet despite the very real and known threat of capital punishment. These were located in taverns, inns, coffee houses, ale houses, these alka-social places. And occasionally, in rooms or houses run by an individual and then stocked liberally with alcohol to create an alka-social space. Alcohol was always present. These community spaces bore witness to cross-dressing, hookups, and camping activities, these elaborate rituals. There were staged marriage ceremonies, fake births where individuals gave birth to wooden babies, tea parties where people would sit around the table and just fake gossip. Sounds like apparently that hasn't changed. They would fake parlor gossip. They would dress up as ladies' maids and be like, "Let me tell you what the Lord did." And then they would out themselves. There were formal dances where some would dress in extreme versions of masculinity and others would dress in extreme versions of female court dress. There was singing, there was playing of music, there was dancing. It was a chance for just a little while to not be alone, to not feel different, to not feel broken, hated, wrong. Who were the Mollies in the Molly House name? These were a subset of mostly homosexual men, although some cross-dressing individuals, we cannot pin down a specific gender identity. And they were characterized by notions, 18th century notions, of effeminacy. Now, in the 18th century, effeminate meant weak, as in literally unable to go to war. It used to be a term that was lobbed at an army. You lost that battle because you were effeminate. But it came to mean too obsessed with your clothing, and then too interested in other men, homosexual. It's very much used today to mean that. It started in the 1800s, or in the 1700s. Why a Molly House? Well, first of all, there's that alka-social space. There's the fact that if someone saw you cross-dressing and then you went and you accused them of it the next day, they'd be like, did you really see that? How many drinks did you have? Well, okay. But they were a lot safer than public environments. There were pleasure gardens, such as London's Vauxhall Gardens, where a lot of strange things happened, including random sexual acts in public. But those were okay, because they were heteronormative. Balls and masquerades, sometimes you could get away with a tryst here and there, but if the mask came off and someone was sober, it was an issue. But secreted away in a back room or upstairs, you were much safer in a Molly house. The other thing is that Molly houses were the ideal place to find other Mollies, others that you wanted to join in these rituals with, or others that you were interested in for the way that they dressed and the way that they acted. In the 18th century, there were generally 3 categories perceived of for homosexuality. Now, it was far more nuanced than that, but those are the 3 categories that generally get mentioned in court trials. And they generally are these Mollies, those that said, well, I'm not really gay because I'm only interested in boys. And then, make of that what you will. And then those that say, nope, I'm really only interested in people that are incredibly straight presenting. And that was an entirely different demographic. And those who were very straight presenting would not be at a Molly house of their own volition because they would not want to be seen as effeminate or maybe even identify as homosexual. But they certainly were found at Molly houses because they would sometimes be dragged there. There was an assumption, unfortunately, rather like there is today, and it's just as wrong as it is today, that one could always identify a homosexual. One could always identify, in particular, a Molly, by the way they dressed, by the way they spoke, by the way that they walked. The public in the 18th century was convinced of this, that they could just peer out and find the gays. And there was a panic. And yet, at the same time, aristocrats had a certain elegance to the way they moved that a lot of the growing middle class wanted to emulate. And so they would try too hard, and it would come across as put on. And this led to a lot of false accusations because trying to put on elegance comes across as effeminate to the 18th century eye. And so people were just as wrong as they are today, and there were lots of life-ending accusations that took place. There was a way to identify Mollies. They used it with one another, never in public. Mollies would identify one another at Molly houses using their own dialect. They had maiden names. In a way, this is somewhat similar to drag names. You would have to be introduced to Molly society by another Molly. This is a lot like having a drag mother. And once you were there, you were given your maiden name, and you only used your maiden name. never your birth name. Often these were female names, Madam or Miss or Auntie. Sometimes it was Molly, Mary, Margaret, with your profession. Moll Irons was a famous Molly. She was a blacksmith. The important thing to note about this is that names like Molly, Mary, and Margaret were common names for prostitutes at the time. And this trend continued over. Some of the earliest drag names were also names initially associated with the prostitution scene in the 20th century. And so there's a very interesting connection there. So where were the Molly houses found? We know where some of them were in London, and we can then extrapolate from there as to where they may have been in North America. We know that they were in places like Covent Garden and Lincoln's Field and Holborn. These areas that were not incredibly high class, places where prostitutes were at work. Places where, if you were from the leisure classes and you were seen there, it was assumed, oh, I know what you're up to. And it was not visiting a Molly house, so you had a bit of a cover. And so it's these same locations that we can search here in North America for those same somewhat seedy taverns. Danger was ever present. You see, once Queen Elizabeth reestablished the Buggery Act, homosexuality was a crime. It was deadly until 1861, and it was illegal in the UK until 1967. It was illegal in the United States until 2003. That same act from 1563 was on the books in this country. Sodomy, as it was called, was seen as immoral and against nature. It was a danger to marriage, women, manliness. And so this constant threat of capital punishment made it not only a danger to be viewed as a homosexual for anyone, but it was anyone related to them as well. Not only would you lose your life, but your family would lose everything connected to you: land, title, your home. We're no better here on the continent. Virginia was the first to have a written prohibition against sodomy. They thought about it. 1610, they put it on the books. They changed their mind 8 years later, but by 1661, they kept it there. You can see New York, the Dutch, they definitely decided to put laws there. The English came in and they were like, yeah, that's not such a bad idea, and they kept them. Only Maryland never passed a law. And so Maryland is likely the only place we will never find a Molly house. So how do we find them? How do we find this community if there is this constant threat of death, of pain? Well, insults and accusations are one way. We can look to the documentary record. We can look for people getting accused of being a sodomite, of being Mollies, these terms we've already discussed. But there's also 18th century terms that we can overlook, not just overlooking the word coffee house. We've discussed effeminate, but also referring to someone as being platonic or having a platonic friend. We might think of that now and be like, it's okay to accept platonic love. It's okay to have a hug. This meant my homosexual partner. And then all of these terms that were lobbed about prostitution, part of the reason the Mollies took this on as part of their maiden names were because of the accusations that were used. They were referred to as male prostitutes, as he strumpets. What could be worse than being an upstanding member of society, being a prostitute. And so when we see this, they're not being accused of prostitution at all. The community operated under careful rules, acting one way in public, another way in private. And yet the other way that we can find them are through court cases that were then often turned into broadsides. But we know that as early as the first decade of the 18th century, we have documentary evidence for a thriving queer subculture in England and thus in her colonies. One that is absolutely heartbreaking is known as the Women Haters' Lament. Here's another participatory thing. Has anyone heard of this? Aside from my wife, that's the usual reaction. This dates to 1707. And it points out the fact that this is an ongoing problem, these degenerates. But what's heartbreaking here is that this is an account of a molly house that got busted up. And these individuals were sent to jail. And it was trying to show their lack of manliness by saying even in jail they could not conduct themselves like men, these mollies. One of them hung himself rather than face trial like a man. Another killed himself with a knife rather than face trial like a man. Two of them at the gallows shared a hug and a kiss before the crowd. They were hideously booed, pelted with rotten produce, but they said, if we're going to die, we will die in each other's arms. And then they were hung. And all of this is to say, look, even at your time of death, you couldn't act like a man, and yet this heartbreaking account is one way for us to remember them. That they were willing to be themselves up until the moment of death. And this is 1707. And so many have forgotten their story. Another account comes from 1709. Same group did the raid. This society is for the reformation of manners, who are a bunch of self-appointed morals police. They did raids in 1707 and 1709, and they often would send in agents who for a year or more would go to molly houses, gain maiden names, gain the trust, and then turn around and give all the information to the police so that the molly houses could be raided. And here, the importance of this is that it points out these kinds of people called sodomites. This means it can't be just an act. It's a whole group of people. It shows that in the 18th century there are already people who view themselves as a community. You can't be a type of people, a kind of people, if you don't view community. And then it says, oh my gosh, knots and gangs of them still meet despite our raids. We failed. Look at them. They're still meeting. This shows the tenacity, the fact that given the opportunity, community will still find a way. And now the title of our talk. This is a little bit later. This should give you some hope. 1728, the mollies can't be stopped. It has this joyous line in it, and a lot of the text, feel free to look it up, it's bawdy. But it says, among our own selves we'll be free. It basically says in public we have to act this way, and people are going to absolutely complain about it. They'll say what they want, but when we're together, we'll be free. We'll be who we want to be. And it's listed as one of the songs that was sung. And it's a narrative given by Dalton. This individual was a thief, and he had a tell-all book. Here's all the places I robbed. Here's the molly houses I went to. Man, I had a heck of a life. And it's quite the read. So why archaeology? And I promise you we're getting to the end. Thanks for staying. There's no known archaeological data. Why? Well, in part there's this erasure. Who wants to study the LGBTQ community? They weren't even there. We can't find them. And we know none of that is true. In part, we didn't know what we were looking for. So archaeology can help. It gives a voice to the voiceless. It holds space for this underrepresented community. It helps us combat that inherent prejudice, and it helps us undo human error. One historian working on this, Richter Norton, found an incredible document on molly houses completely by accident. He was flipping through something else and found it stuck to a document on property taxes. Right, so sometimes we just mess up and we staple things to other things that don't go there. And we erase people's lives. Excavation data, though, are at risk for misinterpretation. Seeing feminine-looking things in a tavern, which was one of the few spaces women were allowed to be in, is a way of saying, look, we actually found women, let's tell their story. And it does need to be told. But we need to be careful. We need to look, when are women women? And when are we seeing the gendered performance of femininity? And it's mollies. Drinking spaces, we've got that down. We can figure out what's going on there. But how do we find the stuff of gender? How do you put on gender? Gender's a behavior. We need to then understand the 18th century and understand what it is that femininity looked like. Because the mollies took it to an extreme. And women who were female identified were doing what they did and going about their lives. The mollies were exaggerating it, so we need to look for stuff that is exaggerated femininity, more than what you would expect. Think of perhaps a female-identified individual's closet and the closet of a drag queen. Objects themselves, none of them have gender. We can't look for a certain spot and say, this is where the women go, this is where the men go. So we as archaeologists, we as historians, we need to be better, and we need to look everywhere to make sure that we are not missing anyone or silencing anyone with our assumptions. Because if we do that, we'll be able to connect to culture, sexuality, behavior, and daily activities, even though those activities themselves have no gender. And we'll be able to see the mollies emerging from the mess of data that is the archaeological record. We'll be able to see the broken, shattered remains of history starting to tell the story of the mollies. Which leads to the final thing. We may have found one. The Lovelace Tavern may have been a molly house. We know this because there was an abrupt abandonment, and no one can figure out what happened. It flooded. It fell into disrepair. It fell over. It caught fire. Everything else is beautifully documented. So now we're pouring through the artifacts to try and see if we can figure out where the mollies are. Thank you. Sorry? Yeah, totally got time for questions if you want. Yes?
Was it mere accusation of that sentence?
Often. If you could prove beyond a doubt that you were not engaged in anything untoward, and you had, quote unquote, individuals of good character that could vouch for you, you could survive, but your reputation might not survive. It also depended on who was doing the accusing. So status had a lot to do with it. Oh gosh, I think your hand was up in the back in the black. Yes, absolutely. Nobody get dizzy. Right here? Sure. So this here happened, this was in London. And this particular location, we end up hearing a bit more about it. If you're interested, by the way, I'm going to put this up in case anyone wants to take a picture. We hear more about it also in this particular account. But it was the main jailhouse in London where they were kept, and that's, in fact, where they ended up hurting themselves and all of that. And I'm happy to send, by the way, links to all of these documents and things like that to anyone who'd be interested. I'm not sure the best way to get it out to folks, but I'm happy to do that. Yeah, of course. Yes. In the brown, yeah. I'm sorry, I don't know anyone's name, so just sort of flailing. So the Lovelace Tavern was, I probably shouldn't keep doing this. The Lovelace Tavern is down in the oldest part in the Stadthaus block area of Manhattan. The building's not there anymore, but you can go and see part of it. You can there's a marker that says, hey, this is where it is. And you can read about it a bit on the official website for the Stadthaus block excavations and for the New York Archaeological Conservancy. They've got a bunch of information on it. Up here in Kingston itself? So the hope is to try and check along the water itself. So it's definitely the next step. No, that's totally fair. This is just the beginning, you got it. The first part is trying to chase the individuals because so many of them have been lost to time, and then the locations. That's right. We have to figure out they were there first, and then we can go from there. Yeah.
Do you have the lyrics that you can recite? The lyrics to the song you in the first slide?
I do, and I can also, if there's a way to mute this briefly, I can definitely switch over and pull them up. If anyone wants to see, they are body, if that's going to be an issue or not. Go for it. All right. Let me disconnect this for a hot second. I'll pull it up so you don't have to see me noodling, and then I'll do that. Let me take another question while we do. Yeah. So the Mollies themselves comes from a nickname that was used for prostitutes, and that's kind of where the term Mollies ends up coming from. So the name Molly comes from that, but a Molly house was a house for gay men and cross-dressing individuals who took over this accusation term of, we're going to call you a prostitute because you're gay. So it was basically like as if they were accused of basically being like slut-shamed. And it was as if they then decided to say, well, if you're going to call me a slut, I'm going to take that name and run with it. And then call this a slut house, even though it's that vulgar, right? Even though it wasn't. Come on, computer. And then they went from there with the term. That's right. So to find out, these are my students. To find out where a Molly house was, it was word of mouth. You had to know where to go. Because if they were public knowledge, they would be killed. So we can start here and then I can go down. It's long. You let me know when you've absorbed. Is it still not up? Oh, heck. All right, give me a sec. Let's see if, now? Yeah. Hey, look at that, the joy of HDMI. All right. And try and make it even bigger if you want, yeah? Bigger. Is long. And I can send this out as well. This is where it starts. You have like a verse. So you can let me know when you've absorbed and I'll scroll down. Yes?
Was the term Molly or Molly House generally known among the population, or was it just...
Yes. Yeah, so the term was definitely known, and the concern was that you could be accused of being a Molly. And so you wanted to be careful how you were dressed, because if you were too foppish, if you were too much of a dandy, you could potentially cross into homosexual territory. And so there's a term, it's in the Yankee Doodle song, macaroni. Yep, so that is someone who is an extreme dandy to the point that they are, in fact, a Molly. And so when we talk about the fact that Yankee Doodle, these Americans, these foppish, crazy Americans, they're sticking a feather in their hat, and they're saying, oh, hey, that's all it takes for me to be perfect and good. And actually, not only is it that, it's the extreme. So not only are they uneducated, they think all it takes to be sophisticated is just a feather in their hat, so we're idiots. And just by doing so, we go to the extreme. And so we're also somehow getting insulted by being accused of being gay. So we're a nation that is both homosexual and uneducated. So Yankee Doodle is a heck of an insulting song, and we're like, we love this song. And the English are like, you guys are idiots. And this is what was going on in the 18th century. Yeah. Yeah, excellent question. Let me scroll this down a little bit more so you can... You were warned. So, what was that? The question was, where are the lesbians? And it is a great question. They generally were not in the Molly houses. Lesbians have their own very unique story. It's a lot harder to find them in terms of different spaces because there isn't this sort of Molly house thing. In a way, they were prosecuted less, which is sort of good and sort of bad in terms of we have less documentary evidence, but very good because they survived more. Where were they? 1, boarding schools. A lot of women were sent off to finishing school. This was the place where they were unsupervised. It was completely a female sphere. And so we have plenty of journal accounts of this being the place where you could engage in what they called at the time sapphic intent. The same way that it was sodomitical acts in the 18th century for gay men. The other thing, there you go, there's the end of it. The other place that we have them, and it's the one area where it seems oddly allowed, is in pornography. We actually see depictions of lesbian sexual acts in pornography, and for some reason, this is seen as, well, it's pornography anyways, so it's okay to be scandalous. But if you had had men having relationships with men in pornography distributed at the same level, that would have been a disaster by the public standard. And so there is less homosexual pornography, women and women, but it is out there. And so that itself could be sort of like there was this sort of double standard for a long time even here, where it's like, well, 2 women kissing, that's okay. And then the final place that we'll see it is that we'll often see that if men are away and the woman is keeping the home, they'll often have, and this phrase is used among men as well, a particular friend that will come and visit. And so we'll see in writings and journals and such, visits by one's particular friend. And so we see them in the domestic sphere, and while I don't want to confine women to the domestic sphere, it's where we find evidence of lesbians. It's sort of, if we don't talk about it, maybe it's okay, which is horrific, and yet we see very few trials against women for the same things that men are dying for. It doesn't seem to be that lesbianism is viewed as an attack on masculinity the way that homosexuality is. in 1533. Victoria and things like that. And so things like that, she and then